Hello, and welcome to the Lit Lang podcast, where we break down and analyze a variety of books weekly. My name is Courtney, and today there are some very important guests joining us.
Hi, my name is Anjali.
Hi, my name is Erica, and I'm so excited to be on this Liddy podcast.
That's great to hear.
Hi, I'm Leslie, and today we will be analyzing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. More specifically, how Cuckoo's Nest comments on the cultural context in the 1950s and 60s. The questions we will be focusing on today are, in what ways does this cultural context affect the book? And are the biases and attitudes depicted in the story a product of the character's perspective or Kesey's?
So, let's introduce our first quote. So, our first quote occurs at the beginning of the book on page 6 when Chief Broom is discussing the atmosphere on the ward, but also, more specifically, he's describing the big nurse and her features. And so here's the quote. "A mistake was made somehow in manufacturing, putting those big womanly breasts on what would have otherwise been a perfect work, and you can see how bitter she is about it."
So, in my opinion, the first thing that immediately stands out to me about this quote is the treating of how the breasts are a mistake. So this is obviously kind of a very feminine aspect of the nurse. So it's kind of pointing out that this feminine aspect of her is a mistake, which I think could be indicative of opinions towards women at the time.
I agree with what you're saying, but also another important part about the quote is how the nurse, it says, you can see how bitter she is about it, and I think that's showing how she doesn't really like her femininity and wishes she was, I think she wishes she was more masculine just to have a better, to perform better at her job, because she has to hide her femininity, but it's seen as a mistake, and people on the ward obviously notice it, but yeah.
Well, can I just tie in what both of you are saying? So you're saying she's like hiding like her breasts, like hiding the femininity, but also like going back to what Erica said. Oh my god.
And that she doesn't really like her feminine features.
Well, yeah,
she's bitter about it.
Well, yeah, and that goes back to the historic. So like having like breast is a sign like of sex, right? So like if you had like big breasts, it was considered unattractive because it was like the kind of like pure mindset, like you should have a pure woman, and yeah,
definitely.
So to a certain extent, Leslie, I do agree with you that she's bitter about having those big womanly breasts, as it says in the quote, but I also disagree with you to a certain level, because I interpreted that as see how bitter she is about it, as I don't think it's more bitter that she has those feminine qualities. I think she's bitter about having to give them up to gain her power position on the ward. And I think that she's more bitter about the situation of having to give it up rather than having it itself.
I agree with you there, and I think to a certain extent she is upset that she about her feminine features. But I think where you're coming from is that's definitely a major part of her bitterness about it.
I actually disagree. I don't think that she's bitter that she has to give it up. I think it is quite specific that she's bitter about that a mistake was made in manufacturing. I think you could argue that she wishes she didn't have to deal with this problem in the first place, kind of what, I guess that's what you could say, Courtney, but I think that she does not want to embrace her femininity. I think she accepts because she is kind of a conformist. The big nurse, she wants her own body to conform to her standards of society, and what Anjali was saying, because she's pure-minded, as was the kind of era, this was the 50s. So I don't know if I agree necessarily with what you're saying.
Well, I see where you're coming from, but I don't think I disagree to a certain level, because I don't think she's saying about, I think the bitterness is not really focused on like manufacturing. I think it's, well, yeah, because it says a perfect work. Yeah, I think it's both ways.
Yeah, I like Erica. I disagree with Leslie. She's definitely, I think she's proud. I mean, she's happy to give them up because it means she's also conforming, like she's making the other people in the ward conform.
But so. I don't think that the nurse is likes to conform her. Well, actually, she does because she tries to fit the role, but she likes to be more of like a like a powerful figure that orders other people to like conform to like help them.
Yeah, so like I said before, I do agree with you guys to a certain extent because some of the wording in it does like say like, oh, there it was a perfect work, or it otherwise would have been a perfect work, because you have to think about it during the time period back then. You know, the sexuality and being a male was more dominant than being a feminine, and so saying like as long as she didn't have those womanly breasts, she would have been perfect. But that shows that like automatically once you were feminine, there was some flaw in the manufacturing.
So, yeah, I think, honestly, we might not even be focusing on the most important part of the quote. I don't think what matters is what she's bitter about. I think it's actually what Angeli was saying. I think, because if you look at, I think, literature, and especially this book, there's kind of two feminine archetypes, which is one more like a sexual being, and one is like a mother figure. And I think the nurse is trying to be a mother figure, as is described earlier in this quote. It's kind of saying she's like kind of robotic and nurturing for the ward, and the breasts do not fit this archetype, because I don't agree with you, Courtney. I don't think she's being demonized for being a woman. I think that the demonization in this quote comes from having breasts, which is a sexual thing.
So I do agree with you that that's a sexual thing, but that visual quality to a woman is what kind of, like, you can tell that it's a woman by this. So I think that's where I'm coming from my point.
Her breasts are a major symbol of her femininity, but she does try and cover them up.
Well, I mean, I think they're both two important things, but I kind of think another thing, the point I'm trying to say, kind of also expands into another quote I think we should talk about, which is another expression of sexuality, and it has to do with Harding.
Yeah, so this quote occurs on page 20, and it's when McMurphy is playing cards with the acutes, and Harding is playing along with them. So the quote is, he's got hands so white and dainty, I think they carved each other out of soap. And sometimes they get loose and glide around in front of him, free as two white birds, until he notices them and traps them between his knees. So does anyone want to elaborate or analyze this part of the quote first?
Well, his hands are a major symbol of his sexuality, and his hands are described as very feminine, as they're like flaunting around and stuff. And when he is tucking them in between his knees, he's trying to hide his sexuality and that he's gay, because it's not really about the fact that he is gay or this concept. It's that the actions, and that he's flaunting it and showing it, which is not at this time something that people wanted to be like on display for everyone to see.
Well, to expand on that, I think although I disagree, what's important is not really the flaunting, because being limp-wristed was just like the stereotype that you were gay, but it's really that he was trapping it, which really ties into the conformity of, which makes this point important. And I also want to add on, we can talk about the lavender scare, which was similar to the red scare, but instead it was like the fear of homosexuals. Mm-hmm. So I think,
Well, what your first point, what you're saying, that is what I'm saying about the action of it rather than the concept. That's what I'm saying. The action was more important than the concept that he is gay. It's that he's flaunting it and putting it on display for everyone to see. And that at that point, when he realizes he's doing that, he conforms and tucks it away. But it's really important that he's the fact that he has to tuck it away, because it's not something that people are wanting to be on display.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that the major part of this quote is the conformity. But something I also want to point out is kind of similar to the first quote. I don't think we're focusing on what's important here. I don't think what matters is it the consequence or the action. Because, I mean, if you look at it, what specifically was bad about being gay at the time? And if you look at it, what specifically what made homosexuality a problem is that it was a sexual thing. And so once again, this comes back to my main point, which is I think what this book is trying to comment on about the time period is that sex was a very like kind of taboo thing, and any expression of it, whether it be as a body part or as a like being homosexual, was treated as something so bad that it might even warrant being put in a mental ward.
Yeah, so I see your point, because it going to a mental ward simply because you are homosexual or you are gay, that was a big thing in the 1950s and 60s. But I think it's also important to note that, individuality is also touched on in this novel, through other characters. But so when he traps his hands, but that's him trying to show that he doesn't want to express it because of that concept in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, Court, to add on to what you were saying about how he was having to be put on a mental ward to take him out of society, so society didn't have to see and like his homosexuality was not on display. I think that goes back to my it's connected to like what I was saying earlier about him having to like hide himself because of his sexuality.
Yeah, and there's also a quote on page 194, and Harding is talking about how he's in the ward voluntarily. He is not committed. It's a voluntary thing. It actually says, "I'm voluntary. I'm not committed." So he doesn't want to go back out in society because of the negative attitudes out there.
Yeah, and he gets a lot of negativity and like hatred towards his sexuality being on display, and that's why a lot of the patients feel more comfortable in the ward because they're not being constantly judged for their sexuality, and that's why he's choosing to stay there.
I think that we are kind of restating the same things over and over. I think we have established that in the time period, being gay was something bad, and that is something we've already confirmed. We've already said to be true. What I was trying to say, and I wonder if y'all tend to agree, is the reason because it was seen as something bad is because it is a sexual identity.
Yeah, exactly. I'm agreeing with you. And what's because the hands are symbolic of his sexual nature. And what's worse than straight sex is gay sex, right? So that's why he's there. So
well, I agree, but also disagree with you, because if we look at Vera, she's a very sexual woman. I think we can all agree on that. But she's not in a mental ward. She doesn't experience as much hate, I think, from for her sexuality, because she's I feel like some men tend to like her being all open, and there was one when she was talking to McMurphy and Harding, and asked Harding for a cigarette, and and then asked McMurphy because Harding wouldn't give her one, and she also there was a deeper meaning with that of sexuality.
He fulfills more of a sexual archetype.
Yeah,
but I don't think this is not what I'm trying to say here, because in my opinion, I don't think Vera is presented as a character we're supposed to like. I mean, not like, I mean that we're supposed to see as good, because in the context of the Combine, not the book, because the nurse is presented to be the ideal woman of the Combine. McMurphy is the enemy of the Combine. The patients that listen and follow are good for the Combine, and then they get readjusted. But Vera, what do you all think? Because in my opinion, I don't think Vera is being presented as someone the Combine would like. I feel like if the nurse and Vera met, they would clash because of their different views on sex. So you guys can tell me what you think of this idea.
So I agree with you on this point, because I think that stylistically also Ken Kesey wrote it in a sexual way. Like, he wrote it to show her sexuality, and there were also some ties in of femininity in there, but I think the bulk was of sexuality. So stylistically, from a stylistic viewpoint.
Yeah, because once again, as I said, there's two archetypes of being a woman.
And And back to the big nurse. I mean, the big nurse is the ideal woman because she's like motherly. I mean, she's motherly to the ward. So, who is more of the ideal woman than your mom? Well, maybe not always, but
yeah.
I
What we're saying, I think, is that gender is not the problem. Sexuality is. And it's not being gay that's the problem. It's that you're like having kind of sex at all, and it's something that you're that you need to like that can be coded or seen by looking at you, like your hands.
I think gender still is a minor issue because it's something that you're having to cover up. It's an inconvenience to you, but I agree mostly with you. But I think gender is still like more of an inconvenience.
So yeah, now I think that we've come to kind of a little bit of a consensus on these ideas. I think we should move on to discussing what does Kesey think of it? Like, because that's really important to understanding. Are these his biases, or are we trying to learn something from it? So if anyone has any thoughts to start.
So I want to start to talk. I think, well, it's obviously a mixture. But I think when we're talking about conformity, we should address like the Beat Generation. So it was against cultural norms. So Kesey is writing a book within that generation, and he's writing that conformity to show how cultural norms aren't good. So yeah, I'm not sure.
And I also think, you were talking about the environment that he was in, right, when he was writing the book.
Yeah.
Am I correct? So he was also, he had just recently, when he was writing this book, he was in an environment of a mental ward. So I think that that also helped, like, bring the ideas. And I think that it's a little bit accurate. It's an accurate representation of what was going on in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, but what we're trying to discuss here, we've established this. In the 1960s, this was an era of conformity. I think it was really good. There was this counterculture movement, and now what we need to establish is specifically what is Kesey through his writing trying to present to us. And I think Angeli said
when he talks about like the ideal pure woman, is being a pure woman, like is it something that he believes or?
Well, if you look, the nurse is the antagonist. So I think, to me at least, it is pretty clear that Kesey is against this demonization of sex in society. I think he wants it to be more of a sex forward society. What do y'all think?
I agree with what you're saying. Just and that also ties in with the literary movement he was a part of. So yeah.
So we agree that this book is trying to. I mean, almost you could say it's a theme or an important part of this book is understanding that sex isn't something that should be demonized, and it shouldn't be something that. It's something you have to be ashamed of, like the nurse or Harding.
Did you say it is or isn't something you should?
It isn't. That people like McMurphy and Vera are better.
Yeah, I agree with you because, as you mentioned, McMurphy, he's a character that really represents freedom and individuality. Mm-hmm. So he's clearly inserting those characters for reasons. Mm-hmm. They aren't just there as side characters. Like, McMurphy is a main character in this book, so yeah. I agree with your point.
However, I would say that gender is something we're seeing Kesey's, like, personal perspective, mm-hmm. because even though he's saying sex is good, I feel like a little bit of Kesey's sexism does come through in the way that because gender is shown. Because just in a way, it seems like kind of a double standard that McMurphy is allowed to be, like, free, and he's shown that he can be successful. But for a woman, I guess McMurphy, it's almost a bit nihilistic that for a woman to be successful, they have to be like the big nurse and hide their femininity.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's almost as if you want power, but you're a woman, you have to give up your femininity, and if you're a male, you need to
embrace it. Right. Yeah, that is the motive of this counterculture movement that he was a part of.
Yes.
There's this, like, a cost to embracing sexuality.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So I think we've kind of touched on some good points. Would someone like to summarize everything we've said?
Yeah, to summarize, I think Kesey is criticizing the creation of a society that has such a pure mindset and that sexuality should not be hidden. And I think he's more for the expressing of sensuality.
Okay, that was a great discussion about the book